All right, folks, I think we're about ready to begin. First off, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Francisco. I am with VCS Software. And today's class is titled Administrative Training, Managing Employees. And the purpose of this class is to instruct folks on how to enter employee profiles into the scheduling system. For about the next hour or so, we're going to learn how to add employees into the system, as well as enter things like contact information, hire dates. We're also going to learn how to enter pay rate information as well. Now, this class is designed for folks who may have not been included in the basic setup sessions. Those are the first 7 online courses that we provide. But those that may have not been involved in those setup classes, but they might be responsible for adding new employees as you hire them. So for those in attendance today that have attended the very first basic setup class, we're actually going to be repeating a lot of the same topics. So if you are comfortable with how to enter an employee into the system, we're really just rehashing this. And again, the focus is there might be people within your organization that may have not been involved in the build, but still may need to be responsible for adding new employees. Now, the class is scheduled for an hour and a half. We're probably going to use closer to about an hour of that time. Afterwards, we'll have plenty of time for any questions you might have on the topics we're about to cover. And for the duration of this class, I'm going to be logging on to my database, and I currently have the Schedule app program already loaded up on my desktop computer. I'm going to be logging on with the system's administrative username and password, which is SECADM, and that's also the password. And for anyone that may have attended the basic online sessions, that is the same username and password that you have been using to add employees or to create schedules. So we're continuing to use that login and password until you have created your own logins and passwords for each of your employees. Now, I just wanted to make a brief note about the Go-To training program that we're using for this screen sharing session. On the control panel, you'll notice at the very bottom there is an option to chat with me directly. So you can feel free to send me any questions or comments that you have. And in fact, after you type your message, where it says type message here, right below it, you can choose to send that message to me privately, or you can share your question with everyone else in attendance today. Now we have a fairly small group for this afternoon's class. So I will not be muting the microphones at this time. So if you have a live mic or if you've dialed in, I will be able to hear you. If, however, there's a little excessive noise coming from your offices, I may have to mute it temporarily just to not have to talk on top of anyone. Now, one last thing about the Go-To training, there is a small tab sticking out of the left side of the control panel, and on that tab you'll notice an orange button with a white arrow in it. You can click on that button to hide the control panels. That way you'll be able to see my complete screen. And you may just want to test that out for a moment. Right now, I'm clicking on the top right portion of the screen where you can see a username and password field. You should be able to see that. If not, you may want to click on that orange button I just referred to. And then you should be able to see me clicking on both of those fields. Now, when you minimize that control panel, that small tab will still be displayed. You can move that anywhere you would like, or you can click on the orange button again, and that will make the Go To Training control panel reappear, just in case you would like to use the chat option at the very bottom. Okay, let's get started. So we're going to log in with my administrative login and password. That is SECADM for the username, and I'm going to retype that into the password field. And we'll click on Sign In. Okay, so again, today's topic really centers around adding employees into the system, something that you will have to do before you can schedule anyone. And so we're going to be working primarily off of the administration drop-down menu. We're going to move over to the Employee Center category. And we're going to start with the employee profile screen. When the screen loads up, you should see a list of all of your existing employees on the left side. Now, for some of you that may have just begun your basic setup build, you may not have many employees here, at least just yet. Over to the right, you'll notice several tabs. Thankfully, you will not be required to fill out every single field on every single tab. This afternoon, we're just going to focus on the required fields. And so for each employee that we enter, we're going to collect various pieces of data. Of course, their first and last name. We're going to create an employee code for that individual, and that code will have to be a unique ID, whether it's first initial, last name, which is what I'm using in my database here. You can also use things like badge numbers or employee ID numbers if you would like. We're also going to assign the employee to a group, which for some might be a squad or platoon. For others, it might be a department that they work out of. Now, your list of groups will be based on whatever was entered during your initial build. Groups, as well as the next field, titles, were entered in basic setup class number 1. So if you were to click on this drop-down menu and that list seems a bit incomplete, you may want to refer to whoever attended the basic setup class number 1. Make sure that all of the various groups, departments, or squads have been entered, and all of the different titles or ranks have been entered as well. We're also going to be using the hire date and accrual date. We're going to assign each employee a seniority number, which will determine how that individual is listed on a schedule. We'll talk a little bit about that as we start entering a brand new employee into the system. Up top, you have various checkboxes available. For part-time employees or civilian employees, you can go ahead and mark the checkboxes that apply. If your Agency pays shift differential. You can go ahead and mark that for any employees that can earn differential. Up top, we're just going to click on the Contact Information tab. And here we're only going to focus on entering phone numbers as well as email addresses and possibly a text message address. So those are the primary fields that we're going to cover on this screen. And so I'm going to enter a brand new example or a brand new employee, and we'll click on the New button up top. You should now have empty fields over on the right. And again, we're just going to focus on the required fields. So I'll enter the name of my new employee, and I'll just tab over to get to the next field that I want. Next, I'm going to move over to the Record Details section, and I'm going to assign my new employee a code. Now, in my system, I'm using first initial last name as a code. Again, you're free to use an employee ID number or possibly a badge number might be a better fit for you. That's perfectly fine. But that code has to be unique for each employee that you enter. I will continue using first initial last name. Next, I'm going to select the group or the department that the individual belongs to. Now, this does not necessarily mean what type of schedule they work. Just think of it as a department. So for some of you, it might be a patrol squad. For others, it might be an actual department like administration, payroll, records. In my example here, I'll place this individual on one of my squads. Under title, I'll go ahead and choose the title that fits. And again, just referring to these groups and titles, these are lists of groups and titles that were created during the build. Okay? So if this list looks a bit incomplete based on what your needs are, you may just want to revisit either that class or whomever attended that class and was responsible for building that portion of the system. The last required field on this particular tab is seniority. Now, in my department, I only have about 24 employees. This is going to be my 25th, so that's exactly what I'm going to key into that field. Now, I'm just going to move this window over to the bottom and over to the side so you can take a look at my daily schedule, and I can talk a little bit more about how seniority is used in our system. As you can see on this patrol day shift, I have a sergeant or supervisor working, as well as 3 officers or employees below that individual. Whenever we are listing people with the same rank or title, we always list them in that seniority order. And in other words, looking at patrol day shift, Diane Jordan is my most junior employee or officer working on that particular shift on that day. Let's move this window back into the center. And we've covered all of the items in red. Now there are a few fields, a couple of fields that I'm going to recommend that you use, and that is the hire date and accrual date fields. So hire date is when our employee began working for us. But accrual date is the date that we're going to use to determine how much time this person is accruing based on years of service. So even though this new employee may have started with us on July 25th, they may have come from another department, and they might get credit for the year serving under that other department. So if that is the case, I can change my accrual date to reflect that. This is going to become handy when you start setting your rules for time off accruals. If you accrue time based on years of service, from 1 to 5 years, they get a certain amount. From 6 to 10, they get something else. Our system will always use the accrual date field. Okay. So 9 out of 10 times, your accrual date should match your hire date. Okay. Only if the person that you're hiring came from another department and they're getting credit for those years served, and we're counting those into those rules, you can go ahead and change that date just like I did. And you can also use the drop-down calendar if that's a little easier. Okay? But I just clicked on each field and just typed in my value. Up top, you have a series of checkboxes. Most of this is just for information purposes. However, if and when we create any sort of payroll export for you, we can apply different rules or perform payroll a little differently based on what type of employee you are. So part-time employees might be processed slightly differently than civilians or anyone else for that matter. And so by clicking on the appropriate checkboxes, we can then leverage that information later on, again, for any payroll-related reports or exports that are developed. For my particular new employee, this is an officer, so I may place him on probation, which means that I may be able to omit him from being able to work certain types of overtime or extra duty work. Over to the right, he may be eligible to earn shift differential depending on what hours he works at any given time. And so at some point later on down the line, if and when you are using our system to export your payroll data into your payroll system, you may be instructed on applying additional checkboxes depending on how certain employees need to be processed. And let's just talk about a very brief example where that might be the case. Let's say full-time employees, salaried employees, might receive the same paycheck every 2 weeks. We may only need to report things like cash overtime. Therefore, whenever we process full-time employees, we may not submit things like regular hours worked. We may only be sending things like exceptions, like overtime cash. Now, part-time employees might be a little different. Since they're not getting the same paycheck every 2 weeks, we may have to report their regular hours. Otherwise, of course, the payroll system simply may not know how much they have to pay them. So again, these checkboxes can be useful later on in the payroll process. Now, I've completed the required fields. I'm not going to click on the Save button just yet. I'm going to click on the Contact Information tab next. And here what we're interested in doing is entering in phone numbers, email addresses, and text message addresses. Phone numbers are important in case you plan on generating call lists for filling overtime. These would be the phone numbers that are provided to those that have to make the phone calls. I'll just use the mobile field. I'll punch in the number, and we're going to move on to email address. Now, email addresses are very important, especially when it comes to notifying any employee about anything that's schedule related, whether we're approving time off or overtime requests, we are perhaps reassigning an employee either permanently or for a period of time. Every time we adjust something on the schedule for an individual, it's important that we send them an email notifying them of the change. So you'll want to put in the email address, and for text message address, we're going to recommend that you use the MMS format. That is what we use for texting, things like videos or any multimedia type content, and that's going to be very important for any of you that plan on using text messaging to fill overtime. Our system has the ability to send out overtime notifications to mobile phones and to allow your employees to sign up for those overtime opportunities just by clicking on a link provided on a text message. Because of the character length of the information we're providing, such as the date that we need coverage on, the shift that we need coverage for, we suggest entering the text message address in the MMS format. And that address is going to differ, of course, based on the carrier that the individual uses. So we're not using something like this. That would just be a standard text address. And I'm a Verizon user, but I'm not even sure what mine is, but I think it's something like something along those lines. Okay. So either your employees can provide that to you, or you may have to check with the individual carriers to see exactly how that needs to be formatted. Now, for those of you that do not plan on distributing overtime via text messaging, you can actually leave this field blank. For those of you that are still weighing the possibilities of doing that, you can always go back into any employee's profile and add this at a later time. Okay, we are ready to save our employee profile. It is now listed over on the left with all others. And again, although we only covered the items in red, you may choose to use additional fields such as emergency contact information. You may choose to add things like driver's license information or date of birth. That information will not be used for scheduling purposes, but at the very least, if you don't already have an HR application that captures this information, you're free to enter it into ours. Okay, now that we've saved our employee profile, we can close out of this screen. We're going to stay within the Employee Center, but we're going to move over to the Pay Info screen. Here we'll be able to enter a payroll ID for the individual. We'll also be able to enter pay rate information as well. I'm going to select my brand new employee from the left side of the screen. Over to the right, I'm going to enter a payroll ID number. Now, for those that do plan on exporting data out to a payroll system, this is going to be the payroll ID that payroll system identifies for that individual. So Jim Foster here may have absolutely no idea that his payroll ID number is 1023, and he doesn't have to. When we report any data over to the payroll system, we will send over, of course, his name, but more importantly, his payroll ID. Under standard hours scheduled per pay period, you should see a default of 80 entered into that field. And what that means is that based on when you process payroll, the employee is going to be paid based on an 80-hour work schedule. And that would be 80 hours in a 2-week period. For some of you, it might be 80. For others, it might be 70. That doesn't necessarily mean that's how many hours they're working. That's just how their pay is calculated. Again, the default value is 80, but you can certainly change it here if you need to. Under lunch times, if the individual gets an unpaid lunch, enter that amount of time in minutes, whether it's 30 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever it might be. This is going to be helpful later on if you have someone who is working an 8-hour day, but they're only paid for 7 hours. Well, you want to make sure that there's a 60 in there. And by doing that, what will happen is when that person requests the day off, even though they were scheduled to work from 8 to 4, they might not be charged 8 hours for that day. They might be charged 7 hours because there was an unpaid lunch in there somewhere. We are not going to save. We're going to move on to the Pay Rates tab. And under the annual salary, I'll just go ahead and key that in. And as I do that, you'll notice that the rest of the fields auto-populate. And it's doing that based on that 80 hours. So if I was to change that, then obviously these figures would be adjusted. Now, with regards to pay rates, the only time we use this is for internal reports. If you need to track how much money you're spending on overtime for a particular reason, you will be able to do that through the system. However, pay rate information is rarely sent over to the payroll system. In other words, if we are exporting information out to a payroll company, we're normally doing that with work activity. We're saying an individual worked a certain amount of hours at a particular type of pay rate, whether it's 1.5, 1.0, whatever it might be. But the dollar figures are usually stored within the payroll system since they are the system of record when it comes to pay rates. If you do not plan on extracting any sort of internal reports on things like overtime costs, you do not have to enter the rates if you don't want to. If you do, just make sure that after you have keyed in the rates, you select an effective date and you add that to the salary history. And from this point forward, when there is any pay increases, you will adjust it through the screen, select the effective date, and always add that to salary history. And in the last tab, you'll see that salary history listed. And as time goes by, it'll just keep track of every change made to the salary for that particular employee. Let's click on the Save button, and we're done. Okay, so we're going to go back into the employee profile screen once again, and we're just going to take a look up top at Terminate Employee. Once we have added an employee into the system, we may have to promote them. At some point, we may have to terminate them when either they retire or resign. So I just wanted to take a moment to talk about how that is done. I'll use one of my officers here on my list, and let's first talk about promoting someone or changing someone's title. You'll notice once you select an existing employee, just below the title field, you have the option to update the schedule with that title change. So if this officer is now going to be a sergeant, I can update the schedule and from this point forward, from August 1st moving forward, that individual will be displayed on the schedule as a sergeant. Let's save that. And about 182 schedule entries have been affected. That means based on how far out I've built my schedules, it adjusted 182 work days and switched this employee from an officer to a sergeant, and also changed the default title here in their profile. Now, when this employee leaves, we're going to use Terminate Employee. We're going to select the date that they retired or resigned. You're going to choose the termination type from the drop-down menu. And you're going to enter a termination reason. And you do have to type something in, but it can be anything. Once you click on the Apply button, it will ask you to confirm. And all this means is that based on the date that you provided, it will remove that employee from the schedule, and that individual will no longer be able to access the system. We'll click on Yes to confirm. And we'll click on the OK button. Now, at the very bottom, you'll notice under Employees to Display, it always defaults to active. However, I can choose to see all my deactivated employees. So these are people that have resigned or retired or just plain old left. Now, you do have the option to reactivate any employee. So perhaps this individual retired, but maybe they're coming back to work for us, maybe in a slightly different capacity. Just highlight the individual and click Reactivate Employee. Click Yes to confirm. And once we close out of these screens, that person is back. And we can adjust any part of their profile. Maybe they're going to be working in a different department. They're going to carry a different title. You can make that change if you would like. I'm actually going to push this back to today, put her back to her original title. Okay, so for those of you that are just getting started building your system, there's a few topics that may have not been covered yet. I just wanted to talk very briefly about those. Starting with the employee profile screen, there is a tab here called Application. And the Application tab is going to be used to assign your individual to a validation skill set. Validation skill set determines how that person will be counted towards any minimum staffing requirements you set in the system. So let's take a look at Jim Foster here. He was the last guy we entered. Well, if he's an officer, he needs to belong to the patrol skill set. Now, your skill sets may end up looking a little differently from mine. They're going to be built for your department's needs, not for mine. So you're going to mark which minimum staffing skill sets that individual contributes towards. Next, under overtime groups, these are the types of overtime for which we hire people, and that can be patrol-related overtime. Maybe we need supervisors to fill in on the schedule because we're short. So your overtime groups are basically other types of skill sets that we use for filling overtime. So if Jim here can work patrol-related overtime, we want to make sure that he belongs to the right overtime group. Now, even within those overtime groups, you might have multiple lists that are used for filling overtime, whether it's for department-related overtime or perhaps extra duty work. You're going to use the employee list drop-down menu to select which overtime list that individual belongs to. And again, you may simply not have reached this stage of your build, and that actually occurs during your advanced setup and training classes. Okay, so you'll have to complete your basic setup classes first, then go into your training classes, and then you move on to your advanced setup and training, and that's where you would be instructed on how to create your overtime groups and how to create your employee lists. Let's save that. Let's close that out. Let's go back to pay info for a moment. And along the same lines, for each employee, you're going to notice a work group drop-down menu. That's going to be the contractual group the individual belongs to. That contractual group is going to control holiday pay. It's going to control how much time off employees accrue, and it might even affect how payroll is processed for that individual. Now, based on where you are during your build sessions, you may not have work groups just yet. It's okay. You can still add pay rate information and the other fields that we discussed, and you can always enter this at a later time once your work groups have been created. Now, let's close out of this screen for a moment, and we're going to take a look at a screen called Quick Employee Information Update. Since you might be a few steps away from creating things like work groups or overtime groups, a screen like this might be handy because it allows you to select any group of employees that you would like, over to the right of the Select Employee box, I can choose the type of field or profile field, rather, that I want to change. So here, under Work Groups, we just saw the drop-down menu under the Pay Info screen that allowed us to apply this for each individual employee. Or I could just bring up my entire department, and I can just click and drag those work group assignments. After I make those changes, I can click on the Save button, and I can move on to something else. Here is my skill sets for overtime. Again, I don't have to go into each employee's profile, go to the Application tab like I showed you, and change it. I can just enter this screen and do it for large groups of employees at once. And again, that was found under Quick Employee Information Update. Select the employees that you want to work with. Mark the individual employees on the left, or if it's easier to do it based on your groups, click on the Group button. Select which groups, departments, or divisions you want to work with, and click on Select and Close. What that does is that narrows my list of 25 employees down to 17. Again, I can handpick who I want to include, or I can select all and Select and Close. Highlight an individual, or use your Control button to highlight various people. Highlight the group you want to move them to, and click on this green arrow in the middle. You'll see the current group along with their new group. We have the same for titles. Okay. So hopefully you can use the Quick Employee Information Update to save you a couple of extra steps instead of having to go through each individual employee profile and making changes as needed. Okay, I will not click on the Save button. I don't actually want to make any changes. I will just close out of this screen. And the last screen we're going to take a look at today is called User Profile, also found under the Employee Center category. We need this screen to create a login and password so the individual will be able to access the system. Now, for those of you that are going through your basic schedule build, this is covered during Class 7. So you may not have any user profile set up just yet. And again, this class is designed for those that have to add employees after the schedule build is done. So we make the assumption that those that are attending this class this afternoon have already built their system and are now adding a new employee. Therefore, they have to add a login and password for our new employee. And let's click on the New button to do that. I'm going to enter the username for my new employee, and you'll see the codes that are currently being used for my usernames. You guys might be using first initial last name for a username. You might be using a badge number. That's up to you. For mine, it is the first initial and the first 5 characters of the last name, followed by the payroll ID, Next, I'm going to enter the name of the employee that this login will belong to. Followed by a password. Now, this will be a temporary password that the user will need to change the first time they access the system. So I may choose to use something very simple like last name. I'll have to enter that in twice. Next, if you have multiple dashboard profiles, choose what the default should be. If you do not have any tile profiles, that is covered under your basic setup class number 4. Under the security section, you're going to tie this login information over to the employee that it belongs to. We'll click on Select Employee. We're going to find Jim. And next, we're going to assign him a security profile. The security profile will be what determines what screens the individual can access, what sort of schedule functions they can perform. For my purposes here, this is just going to be a basic user. Now, it's very important that you choose the security profile. You will not be using security level. You may want to make a note of that. Under number of past days to allow update, you're going to determine how far back can this individual go and apply something like time off and overtime. Our recommendation is that you start off with something like 14. And this is important because if you leave it blank or leave it set to 0, what will happen is, and I'll use myself as an example, if I work overtime today, I need to put it into the system today. If I wait till tomorrow, the system is going to lock me out and tell me I'm not able to go that far back on the schedule. So you may just want to provide a small grace period in which people can work overtime and maybe they have a few days to go back and post that onto the schedule. I use 14. You may choose to use less. That's entirely up to you. Next, we're going to force user to change password on the next web login. And this just means that the password we gave them is temporary, and the first time they log on, they will have to choose something else. We're almost done. We're going to click on Web Settings. And under Web Dashboard, you're going to choose the dashboard that they're going to see when they log on to the web portal. Now again, for those of you that have not completed your basic schedule build, you simply may not be this far into the process yet. And really the concept behind this is rather simple. You may have various web dashboards displaying different types of schedules based on the department. And so this just allows you to assign your employee the web dashboard with their specific schedule so that they don't have to hunt around for what's most relevant to them. After you select the web dashboard, click on the Save button. And now your new employee will be able to access the system with the login credentials and password that you provided. Let's close that out. And that's it for managing employees. Again, for those of you that had attended the first basic setup class, you'll notice a lot of these items were covered during that session. And for those of you that have not finished your basic setup classes, some of this might appear somewhat out of context just because you haven't talked about work groups yet. If that is the case, you can always complete those basic setup sessions, and you can always attend this class again, or you can always attend help out sessions if you have individual questions about how your department handles these items. So we're just shy of the 1 hour, but at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions that you have about what has been covered. And again, I have not muted the microphone, so anyone that has dialed in or has a live mic, I will be able to hear you. Or you can use the chat option on the GoToTraining control panel.
This is Alan. I'd just like to thank you. It seemed like you went over everything.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, please be sure to use the help out sessions. We're always releasing more of those, and for those of you that are not familiar with what those are, number one, we acknowledge that the setting up of the system can be somewhat of a daunting task, and they are being done in a group format, so sometimes you might be in with another agency or department. If you run across any issues completing any of the build items, you can sign up for the help out sessions. Those are one-on-one, so you're not sharing that time with anyone else. They're 45 minutes in length, and you have the floor. You tell us what you're having issues with, and we can assist you with your specific needs. And those are free, of course. Okay. Any other questions? Anything you'd like me to take another look at before our session ends today? And by the way, if you're more comfortable using the chat, go for it. Okay. One last thing I'd like to mention, and I know I've been talking a lot about this basic setup class 1. If you've attended it or you just haven't had a chance yet, or you think you might need to repeat the class, you'll notice that when you register for that, you will have an email sent to you, a confirmation email. On that email, there is a link to a PDF document that outlines everything that I just covered, minus the user profile screen. So if you feel that would be helpful, just screenshots of how to add an employee into the system. Just by signing up for that class, you're going to get that document sent to you. And there are documents like that for each of the 7 basic setup classes. Okay. But if there isn't any questions at this time, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for registering, and I'll just leave the session open for another minute in case anyone has any last-minute questions. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Have a great day.